She laughed a little too close to the CEO's ear, and nobody noticed the woman in the doorway tightening her grip on the bouquet. The lobby had been warm with congratulations, clinking glasses, the low hum of a band packing up, waiters folding napkins. Sam Jud moved through it like someone accustomed to light and shadow at the same time. People gravitated to him for the same reason they whispered about him when he wasn't in the room. The authority made casual things look intentional. Tonight, the pitch had landed. Their firm had just edged Goldcorp out of a bidding war. The wind tasted like relief and champagne. Nina had planned to be invisible. She always let Sam take the public moments. They had an arrangement that suited both of them. She had been at 3 tables over, half hidden behind a pillar, accepting congratulations from people who thought they'd found her by chance. She had a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand, a silly little thing someone had pressed into hers with a grin, and a phone in the other with a screen full of benign messages. The bouquet was how she had intended to leave the party, quietly, with flowers tucked under her arm and the warm noise of celebration behind. Then a woman approached Sam. She moved as if she owned the space between them, heels that clicked, a skirt that considered the rules and decided to reinterpret them. Her name, as Nina would learn later, was Mira, a consultant from a small firm that had tried to cozy up to Sam during the pitch season. Now, under the ceiling lights, Mira made a joke that bent too close to familiarity. She laughed, head tipped, and Sam answered with the kind of half-laugh leaders learn to deploy, quick, polite, unobliging. It was the kind of exchange that reads differently when someone is watching. The woman at the door watched. Nina had been late to the dinner. A delayed subway and a mustard stain on a sleeve had made her decide to arrive after the speeches. Standing where she did, not hidden but not announced, she saw the arc of the moment in its simplest lines. Mira's hand on the armrest, the tilt of her neck, Sam leaning in just enough to hear. No one said anything. The cameras on everyone's phones were already drunk with the party. Someone in the crowd reached for a lens. The first photograph arrived on a battery-charged heartbeat after Nina moved away. She hadn't meant to check her phone then. The first message was a thumbs-up gif from a junior designer named Max. Then, under that, a forwarded photo with no caption, crisp as if cut from glass. Mira laughing with Sam's face turned toward her, a shoulder nearly touching. In the background, Illard, Nina's bouquet sat on a nearby ledge. Someone had caught it. Someone had even chosen the right second to press. If you love twisty office romances, stick around. The voice in her head was not the rational one. It belonged to every rumor she'd read and every headline she'd hidden from Sam.
The office could survive on numbers and deadlines and meetings. It could also survive on gossip like a fever. The photo went into a group chat. It rippled. They called themselves the Strategy Channel, a curated mess of people whose hours tracked with the rhythm of bids and client dinners. The chat did what these chats always do. It boiled an image down to a few emojis and a smell of scandal. Max, oh my God, LOL. Jules, who is she? Mr. Cannot, looks like Mira from Northbridge. She's been on 3 bids this quarter. Faye, boss-level vulnerability. Sam, a hand clap emoji. Unknown, do we have a policy on mixed drinking at client events? The messages multiplied like bubbles. Someone added a screenshot of the photo into a private thread labeled "For the Execs." 2 texts later, it had been copied into 3 different phones and a cloud storage folder. Someone forwarded it to a client contact at Goldcorp. Someone else sent it to Hans Shaw. Nina scrolled and did not cry. The hurt held itself like a physical thing in her sternum, heavy and hot and precise. She had known Sam before he had been the kind of man who could cinch a room's attention with a half-turn, before his hair had gone a little more silver and his suits had acquired names. They had picked each other in quieter times, in apartments with second-hand furniture, in long bedside conversations that were mostly silence and the steadying presence of another breath. They had built a small language out of everyday things, the brand of coffee he kept in the pantry, the way he always saved her a seat in meetings, the habit of tucking a napkin into his pocket on a day when he knew he wouldn't have time for lunch. Their marriage had remained private on purpose, not secret in the way of something shameful, but private because Sam had learned early that his life at work always wanted to expand to swallow everything. Nina preferred to live her life without the additional commentary of press or podium. She liked the small acts, cooking pancakes on a Sunday, leaving a note on the fridge, that were the real proof to her, more than any photograph. Yet here was a photograph with 1,000 possible meanings, and only one interpretation that mattered to the people seeing it, that Sam had let someone else step inside the private space she thought they'd agreed to protect. Sam's phone did not blow up at first. Leadership keeps a certain distance that looks like calm. He laughed with the others for the cameras, answered the predictable questions, and thanked clients with the automatic charm that had gotten him to this level. He did not do grand gestures. He did not do speeches about emotions. He walked toward the door and found Nina where he had left her, a little raw, bouquet in hand, face arranged into something like composure. He took her hand, and it was a small, efficient thing. The touch said, "I am here," but he did not yet know how to say the rest. They left the party without fanfare.
On the street, the temperature had dropped and the city smelled like wet concrete and car exhaust. He offered to hail a cab. She declined. She wanted the walk. The bouquet loosened petals as she moved. "I'm sorry," Sam said, unpracticed in apologies beyond the ones he used when a client's spreadsheet had an error. It was a small sentence blown into the space of a city block. It felt insufficient because the hurt was not about the 5 minutes in the lobby. It was about the idea that their life could become a spectacle. Nina looked at him. She had ways to measure him, by how long he took to answer texts, by the small attentions he gave her without saying anything. She watched his jaw when he considered the world. It was taut, like a wire pulled too tight. "It was a picture," she said. "It's a picture that will turn into a story." "You're right," he said, "and I'll fix it." He said it with the certainty of someone who knew how to manage outcomes. But there are outcomes that involve human feelings that aren't controllable with spreadsheets, and Nina needed more than a promise. She needed a conversation that held the kinds of things you can't smooth over by calling a PR person. She needed him to see, to step into the place she had occupied at the doorway. They walked home under the thin light of street lamps. At the kitchen counter, the kettle boiled. They sipped tea like two people returning to a houseboat after a storm. There was an argument they didn't have about whether he had been too friendly. Instead, he pulled her close and spoke in a voice that was used to leading rooms but not so often used to holding a single person. "You don't have to be on stage with me," he said, and the sentence held something true and fragile. "But if you ever choose to be, I want you to be there from the right seat." She wanted to say that privacy had been their pact. She wanted to say that secrets and publicity had different consequences for different people. Instead, she asked, the question that had been a quiet stone in her pocket, "Why didn't you tell them about us?" He hesitated. Sam's reluctance was not because he was ashamed. It was a calculation about risk. Public life was a magnifying glass. He had learned that being married to someone in his position could turn into a liability for employees who might imagine unfair favoritism, for clients who might see soft spots, for the press, who always looked for edges on which to hang suspicion. "We decided to keep the line," he said, "not to hide you, but to protect what we have. I thought I was doing it the right way." Nina thought of the small breakfasts he made when the world was brutal to her ego, the way he would toast bread a little darker because she liked it that way. She thought of their late-night phone conversations when deadlines made her doubt her own work. The private things stacked up to something that felt like a life.
She could see, in the quiet that followed his sentence, the calculus and a loneliness she hadn't signed up for. "Was it worth it?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time that night, the leader felt like two people deciding in a kitchen what to do next. "I thought it would be," he said. "Maybe I was wrong about the method, but not about you." There was a way that assurance could bandage. It did not heal everything. They slept with the window open, the city murmuring, both of them alive in a way that was not immediately reconciled. Morning arrived with the kind of thin light that makes every object too clear. Her phone blew up with messages she would rather not have seen. The image from the night had traveled to places she did not know. She scrolled through the strategy channel and then through a dozen more threads where people speculated and laughed and drew conclusions. Someone had put the photo up with an offhand comment about being lucky. At the office, the air was different. People avoided Sam's eyes, or they homed in with the enthusiasm of the small predator always looking for prey. Max sidled up to Nina by the coffee machine. "You okay?" he asked, because for all his ambition, he was also human enough to care. She gave him a small smile, the kind you hand to strangers to say you will be fine. "I will be," she said. Word moved like a current. The tender they had pitched for, the Goldcorp contract that could change the next year of the company, had been messy and close, and finally theirs. Now it hung between them like a brittle ornament. Goldcorp was famously meticulous about optics. Their decision-makers wanted stability, not romance that might become a headline. One of those decision-makers was Hans Shaw. Nina had known Hans in a different life. College wine nights, the quick intensity of young love before careers ate the edge of everything. He had been bright and competitive. He had also been the sort who treated people like moving parts.
Their break had been quiet and immature, and both of them proud enough to never have admitted its sting. Seeing his name attached to Goldcorp now felt like a small, sharp salt in the mouth. He texted, later that day, a question that could have been about royalties and numbers, but read as a duel. "Will you be at the closed session on Thursday?" Sam replied with a curt message. "Always." He meant the tender. He did not mean the same things as Hans thought he meant. Rumors have a way of seeking impetus. Within 24 hours of the photo's first circulation, someone had compiled a timeline. A junior associate made a thread in which they noticed that the woman in the photograph had worked to get close to Sam during 3 previous events. Another person found a LinkedIn page with an embarrassingly friendly comment from Mira pinned at the top of her recommendations.
Someone else flagged that a journalist who'd been friendly with Goldcorp's PR firm had been at last night's gala taking notes. From inside the strategy channel came an edge. Who leaked it? Why had it been posted? Who thought it was funny? The office split into factions like tide pools dividing a shoreline. Some rallied around Sam because their paychecks were tied to his decisions. Others stood at a distance and watched the waves. At the center of it all, Nina felt the old reflex of someone who had spent years turning a glaring light into a smaller domestic lamp. She wanted to call Sam's assistant and ask, "What are we doing here?" She wanted to text the person who had posted and insist they take it down. She wanted to be furious at the woman in the photo. She wanted, more than anything, for the world to stop selecting the wrong things and blowing them into public evidence. There was another knock at the door that afternoon. Faye stood in the hallway with a bag and the kind of half grin of someone who had been through noise enough to understand both the pain and the absurdity of the world. Faye had been an old classmate, the kind of person who seemed to have a gravitational pull older friends talked about fondly. She had a widow's softness to her now, an exterior gentled by loss, and yet she carried a quiet strength. "You look like you want to disappear," she said, stepping inside, "or go on a television interview. One of the two." Nina laughed, the sound halfway to a sob. Faye sat with her on the couch, and in the kitchen she made an offer to be an ally in the small ways. Pick up takeout at 2 in the morning. Be the person who keeps messages steady when the world spins. The tender loomed like a tide. In the office, Sam closed ranks with his leadership team. Mr. Knott, old in ways that meant he spoke like someone who had led more companies into storms than he could count. Max, who could be ruthless when he needed to weigh clients against ethics. And Jules, who sought truth like a diamond cutter. They held a meeting in the glass conference room where the light made everyone look older. "We can't let headlines dictate the narrative," Sam said, a professional cadence he used when making strategic decisions. "This is a business moment. We earned this tender on merit." "It's not just headlines," Mr. Knott said. "It's optics. Goldcorp will look at the entire package. They want a partner that offers predictability. They don't want a circus." Sam heard the sentence and felt its truth. The tender had always been part relationship and part numbers. There was an intimacy to business that looked dangerously like personal life. He had tried to keep the two from intersecting, but a photo had done what his planning could not. That afternoon, the CEO's office received a friendlier message that read like diplomacy. "Heard about the gala. Saw the photos. If you need me to call in a favor, I'd be happy to help." It was from Hans. Nina could feel the room tilt.
She remembered Hans's mouth on hers at the university library, the way he had spoken about strategy as if it were a lover. The thought of him leaning in now, not for her but against their team, felt like another betrayal, not of flesh but of placement. She wanted to be angry at herself for letting the memory larger than his person bother her. She wanted to be angry at Sam for having kept their marriage out of the open. She wanted to be angry at the world for allowing one photograph to become the primary architecture of a story. At home that evening, Sam sat across from Nina with a stack of papers fanned across the kitchen table. Tender timelines, client itineraries, roles for the bid presentation. He was stubborn in the way he prepared for crisis. He had done it since he was 25 and learned that nothing calmed a client like a plan. "I want to be transparent," he said, "not performative. Transparency so we can control it." Nina watched him. She wanted to tell him everything, that the photograph had become a vector, that Hans's message had landed like a pebble in dark water, that her sense of safety had frayed. She wanted him to see the small gestures he took for granted. He reached out and brushed a petal from the scabbed edge of the bouquet that had slumped in the vase. Small things mattered, she knew that, but there were bigger things now, like the way reputations could be scavenged for the next headline. "Call him," she said suddenly. "Who?" he asked. "Hans." Saying his name was a release. Sam hesitated. The muscles along his jaw tightened. He had built walls around certain conversations. Sometimes they were there to protect other people. "If I call Hans, it will be interpreted," he said. "It could be seen as trying to smooth things over, and if he reaches, he might be doing it for leverage." She understood that logic. She also understood leverage.
In a world where tenders sanction careers, Hans's conversation could be a courtesy or a threat. "I don't want to play chess with my life," Nina said. "I don't want to find out which move makes us safe. I want to know you're choosing us." Sam put his hand over hers. The gesture was simple and held a kind of answer that was both strategy and surrender. "I choose you," he said. "I've chosen you for a long time." Then, because some things cannot be negotiated once they exist, Nina did something small and terrifying. She pulled a strip of paper out of her bag, a white stick with a faint line that had been there when she left the lobby. She had thought all morning that she might be over-interpreting the weekend for the sake of momentary grief. She held it up like a small defiant proof. Sam saw the test and read the nuance in her face before he saw the result. They had always been practical people, and the test was an intimacy by numbers, lines and negatives and small instructions. When she let him see the faint second line, his face did not harden with surprise.
He did not stiffen with fear. He exhaled in a way that was half laugh, half sob, a sound that belonged to someone who felt the weight of consequence and the startling ease of a new arrangement. "There will be people who mess this up for us," he said, voice low, "but we can decide how we say it. We don't owe anyone a running commentary. We just have to be honest with each other." They moved then in a murmur of private calculations. They would tell the people they trusted first. They would decide how and when to make a public statement that would be true and deliberate. They would set boundaries at the office, make it clear what constituted professional conduct, and draw a line where gossip had no place. Sam promised to speak to HR about the photo and who had posted it. Nina promised to be a public partner when the time was right. It was a plan that felt like a vow in a different register. For a moment, they stood on the same ground. It felt like a small victory, less a public triumph and more a personal truce. They ate dinner at the table in silence, hands finding each other over a plate of pasta. The ordinary ritual of feeding one another made them real again. But events are greedy. That night, the photograph metastasized into something else. A local blog lifted it with a caption and a speculation. Someone in the strategy channel forwarded the blog link. It appeared in the notifications of people who had once written bad columns about Sam's firm, and it landed among the people who wanted the firm to fail. Then there was the call. Sam answered in the way he always did, steady, measured, with his face rearranged into the mask of someone making a deal. When he hung up, his hand trembled in a way she had not seen since the night he had told her he would take a risk on his firm. "It's Hans," he said. "He wants to talk, tonight." Nina felt the temperature shift. She had wanted him to call Hans like a purge. She had not expected Hans to show up in the same orbit so quickly. The timing felt like pressure. Too soon, and it would look defensive. Too late, and they would look weak. "He's not what he was," Nina said. It was both a confession and a plea. "He was young. You were young. You're not the same people." Sam looked at her, and for a second a private smile softened his face. "No," he said. "We aren't." He left to speak with Hans in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and rain. Nina sat on the couch and watched the bouquet collapse petal by petal into the water. The light outside the window turned amber and then went dark. She opened her laptop and watched the comments widen like a map of small slights. At the conference hall the next day, the atmosphere was taut. Sam walked into the room with a team and a script. People greeted his calm as if it were a kind of magic. Mr. Knott stood to the side and waited, a sentinel used to the rhythms of storms.
Max moved through the room with the pragmatism of someone who could also be cruel when strategy demanded it. The cameras were more interested in context than they had been the night before. From a managing director to a caller waiting for the pitch, everyone wanted to be reassured. Then Hans arrived. He stepped into the lobby with the efficient stride of a man used to getting results. There was no fanfare. His name echoed in the room in whispers, not introductions. He carried the collected aura of a person whose job had been to weigh risks and choose winners. He paused just long enough for people to take note. He did not look around for Nina. He did not look for anyone specific. His eyes, when they saw Sam across the room, had the cool appraisal of an adjudicator. Sam saw him, and the room shifted, tiny and seismic. The tender, the day's technicalities, the client presentations, the numbers, felt suddenly smaller and larger at the same time. This was the sort of meeting where history got written in margins. This was the kind of moment where relationships were inspected for leverage. At the far end of the lobby, Nina took in the exchange without moving. She had a new kind of armor, the quiet news she and Sam had shared. It was not a shield against public opinion, but it slowed the impact of 1,000 small insults. Even so, when a junior emailed her a screenshot later that morning,
Hans' arrival and a whisper of an old photograph he had commented on with a neatly placed emoji. The old heat of panic crawled along her skin. She forwarded it to Sam with 3 small words. "Do something." He read it. He replied, "I will." In the conference room, Sam kept his face a public instrument of calm. He met Hans in the middle of digested coffee breaths and the rustle of paper folders. The conversation was at once corporate and intimate. Hans asked questions that were pointed but not directly personal. Sam answered with the kind of answers that left no space for narrative to sprout. They discussed deliverables, timelines, metrics. They spoke in the language of work until the conversation brushed against the photograph with the gentleness of a skiff skimming ashore. "You've always made your own rules, Sam," Hans said at one point. There was an old electricity in his voice, like a chord remembered. "That has worked for you. It terrifies people who like control." Sam's reply was a lesson in composed speech. "And you've always liked control," he said, "which is why you're sitting where you are." The exchange had undercurrents, histories that neither fully named. Nina watched from the glass wall, and a strange comprehension came over her. The office was not just a place of work. It was a map of all the versions of themselves they had been, and all the people who still had claims on that history. When Sam came out of the meeting, his face was the same as it had been when he went in, steady and purposeful.
But there was an after in his stride, a fact he couldn't hide. He had been measured by someone who had history with his wife. It was a peculiarly private kind of exposure. That night, the strategy channel bloomed again. Someone had posted an old photo of Hans and Nina from college as a joke, captioned with a heart and an arrow. People laughed. Others didn't. One of the messages was blunt. "Watch the narrative," someone wrote. People were watching for the next thing. Nina and Sam sat at the kitchen table with 2 steaming mugs of tea between them. The world outside hummed like a distant insect. They considered plans they could not yet put into motion. There would be a statement, Sam said, but carefully planned. There would be an internal memo to remind employees of privacy policies. There would also be boundaries set for clients and consultancies. Words like protocol and PR strategy floated between them like lifelines. "We can make the narrative or they will," Sam said. "If they make it, it'll be salacious and not true." "That's usually how the internet prefers things," Nina said. She had the faintest of smiles that bore both irony and fatigue. "It wants drama. We want dinner and a good mattress." They laughed, and the laughter was the kind that loosens the muscles for a moment. Sam reached for her hand again. His skin was warm. He looked at her with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with spectacle. It was small, and it mattered. "You told me you were pregnant," he said then, quietly, as if naming the fact aloud made it more real. She felt the air leave him a little. "I did," she said. There was an intimacy that came from sharing a secret that was not yet a public fact. It turned the momentum of the last 48 hours into something entirely different. The tender still mattered. The photograph still rippled out like a stain. But inside the kitchen, the two of them had a new private equation. This would not be neutral to the world. It could make them more vulnerable or more credible. It could also change the calculus for Hans. In the privacy of their conversation, Sam could be less measured and more human. He stood and reached into the drawer where they kept old photographs and plane tickets and lottery stubs. He took out a small card he had written on once, a message from their early years, ink bleeding slightly from the paper. He put it back slowly, like a relic. "We will tell the people who need to know," he said. "We'll tell the ones we trust. We will not let gossip be the first thing out." They arranged a list: parents, a handful of trusted friends, the HR director. It was a plan that did not feel like a press release. It felt like a shared decision. They did not know then that the photograph had already tapped into conversations beyond their control. In a corridor at Goldcorp, somebody had shown the image to a colleague who liked to run comments past his friend on the board.
In an elevator, someone else had commented on Sam's matrimonial status as if it mattered. In social media, the blog's comments had metastasized into speculation. The photograph had an appetite for meaning other than the one they intended. On Wednesday morning, a push notification buzzed across Sam's phone. It was from a news app. The headline was inflammatory in a way that made everything more delicate. Nina saw the sharpness. Nina saw the sharpness of the headline before she read the first paragraph. The notification cut across the quiet kitchen like a match struck too close to curtains. CEO caught flirting at gala. Is his marriage at risk? It was the kind of headline that didn't need to be accurate to be damaging. It only needed to be loud.
Sam looked up from his tea, eyes narrowed, measuring the angle of the words before he could swallow them. He slid the phone across the table. "They'll run with anything," he said, and his voice was the same calm one people mistook for indifference. "This is different," she told him. "It's not just a rumor, it's a timeline, a comment thread, a narrative someone else controls." They had agreed earlier, in the warm, pragmatic way they often made plans. List the names, tell the people who mattered, set the pace. Now the pace was no longer theirs. The internet had already made a version of the truth. Sam set the phone down with his hand steadied. "We choose the frame," he said. "We control what we can control and we answer directly when we need to. No dramatics. We'll tell the people who should know first, then we handle gold." Nina watched him the way she usually watched him in meetings, not only to read the outward decisions, but to find the shadow reasoning underneath. This was his world. This was also their life. The line between the two had just been blurred so thoroughly that it felt like sand in the hinges. The call from a Goldcorp director came sooner than expected. A voice that could have been read as sympathetic asked whether Sam wanted to set up a private conversation before the closed session. "We like to know who we're partnering with," the director said carefully, "especially when optics might affect performance." Sam answered with the practiced candor of someone at the apex of negotiations. "I understand," he said. "If you'd like, I can come by before our presentation and introduce certain people. I don't want rumors to take the place of numbers." The director hesitated. There was an audible calculation, and then accepted. "Please come by," she said. "If you're sincere, that will matter." The day stretched long with preparation. In the glass-walled conference room, Sam ran the deck while Nina met with HR and legal to align on protocol. Mr. Knott, Jules, and Max circled with the gravitas of people trying to close a wound with competence. Everyone had opinions, most had tactical ones. Nina had only one that mattered to her. She wanted to be part of the disclosure on their terms.
Sam drafted a brief statement for the internal channels, a corrective note reminding everyone of privacy and professional boundaries, and a line about focusing on merit. He was strategic, as always, but there was something new under his surface, an urgency that came from being accountable to more than clients. The pregnancy, the faint line on the test, had changed his calculations, not as a negotiation chip, but as a compass. When they left for the Goldcorp building, the city felt like a set. The lobby was larger than any office they'd ever worked in. The marble and glass made their ordinary gestures look practiced. Hans was already there, sitting with the kind of measured ease that meant he had placed himself where he wanted to be seen. He rose to greet them the way you greeted an opponent on the line between courtesy and war. "Sam," Hans said, smile practiced. "Good to see you." Nina felt a shade of something, remembered tenderness, that she folded away and set aside. This wasn't about nostalgia. It was about leverage and presence. She walked at Sam's side, not behind him. The private meeting with Gold's directors was sparse with small talk and rich with directness. The lead director, a woman named Mara, said exactly what needed to be said. "We want to understand if your leadership is stable. We want to know whether your decisions are going to be distracted by," she tipped her head toward the news app notification that still glowed on phones, "external narratives." Sam didn't dodge. He spoke without flourish and with an economy he had cultivated for years. He introduced his team, made clear the deliverables, and then, at the end, said something he almost never did in public. "There's a personal matter that came to light last night. I will address it in brief. The photograph some of you have seen was misinterpreted. The person in the picture is a consultant who approached me at a public event. There was no impropriety. More importantly, my wife Nina and I are expecting a child. We've chosen privacy for specific reasons, but I want to be clear. My commitment to the firm and to our work is absolute." The room processed that. You could see the pulse of recalculation. Truth, when delivered with gravity and not defensiveness, has a way of reshaping suspicion into simple facts. Mara asked for a moment to confer with her board. When she returned, she spoke with the kind of clarity that decided budgets. "We expected forthrightness," she said, "and you gave it. We're reassured." Back at the office, when Sam rejoined his leadership team, his posture was heavier in a way that had nothing to do with success. He had chosen the path of honesty in front of a client. There would be critics, of course. This was inevitable. But he had also chosen to make their private life a brief bridge in the service of the tender, rather than a river of speculation. There was fallout still. The strategy channel humored itself with editorializing. Someone had posted an anonymous poll asking whether leaders should declare their relationships. Another person shared a column linking leadership and personal transparency, as if the solution could be reduced to a set of checkboxes. At her desk, a message arrived from Mira. Nina did not open it at first. Her hands hovered over the screen like someone deciding whether to pick up a knife. Eventually, curiosity and a need to understand won out. Mira's message was short and uncluttered. "Nina, I'm sorry if my presence last night caused trouble. I didn't know. Can we talk?" Nina read it twice. The finger that hovered over the reply trembled. There were many possible versions of Mira: the ambitious networker, the woman leaning on charm to gain clients, the calculation of someone cued into social advantage. Nina had seen similar people before, and she had learned the fragile eloquence needed to decide when to be magnanimous and when to be guarded. She replied, "Yes, let's talk tomorrow." The next morning, Mira appeared at the office coffee machine looking less like a predator and more like someone who had practiced vulnerability like a new song. She had a small protector's apology that was almost immediate. "I didn't realize," she said. "I approached Sam like everyone else does. Connection, business. If it came across differently, I'm sorry. That wasn't my intention." Nina listened. There was a softness to Mira's explanation that felt true, but there was also an awareness that hurt didn't need theatrical evidence to be real. "Intentions matter," Nina said, measured, "but so do consequences." Mira nodded. "I'll take more care. I care about my career, but I don't want to damage other people in the process." It was a small reconciliation. Nina accepted the apology on the terms she chose. No grand gestures, no public performance. That evening, Mira sent a brief message to the strategy channel apologizing for any perceived familiarity and asking that colleagues avoid speculation. It didn't stop the gossip entirely, but it slowed the vector of vengeance that often feeds on drama. Not everyone in the office was satisfied with apologies. A junior associate who had forwarded the photo into the execs folder, thinking perhaps that being the first to surface a scandal would win them favor, found themselves in HR for a frank conversation about ethics and responsibility. Sam insisted the reprimand be fair. The person would receive training on confidentiality and be placed on a probationary period. He refused a firing that would become a public spectacle. "People make mistakes," he said, "but we also teach people to do better." That attitude, firm but not punitive, began to shift the tone. The public hunger for spectacle responded to moderation by losing interest. The internet was a meat market for outrage, but outrage needed a continuous feed. Once the feed dried, people moved on. The tender went ahead.
The presentation unfolded with the same careful choreography of proposals and projections that Sam's teams had rehearsed for months. When the final questions came, Sam answered with the kind of plain authority that grew out of competence. In the end, Goldcorp selected their firm. The vote was close, and Hans's group had been heard, but the deciding factor had been the quality of the plan and the clarity of the leadership, facts over fiction. After the award was announced, there was a small moment Sam had not scheduled but had known he wanted. He stepped to the podium with a document packet in hand that held the tender contract signature copies and a small, unscripted sentence he had prepared for himself. "Thank you," he said, to Goldcorp and to the assembled press, "for choosing us based on the work. My team has done remarkable work to prepare this proposal, and they deserve that recognition. I also want to say briefly, this past week a photograph was circulated that mischaracterized a professional public exchange. It was hurtful to the people involved. I am married to my wife Mina, and we are expecting a child. We ask, as we ask all partners and colleagues, that the focus be on the work we deliver and not on the private lives of the people who deliver it." It wasn't grandstanding, and it wasn't deeply personal. It was a statement that drew a line. The cameras shifted, and this time the narrative that would run the wires focused more on the tender win and the firm's pitch than on tabloid speculation. Outside, as they left the building, Hans caught up with them. The conversation he offered was quieter than the one in the lobby. "You handled that well," he said to Sam. "More importantly, you handled it humanely." Sam nodded. There was something about Hans's tone that implied their old history, memory, and rivalry, but also a kind of respect. "We have to be smart about reputation," Sam said, "and sometimes we have to be brave about our lives." Hans's hand skimmed Sam's shoulder briefly, a small public signal that said something like peace. "You too deserve that," he admitted. Then his eyes turned to Nina, and the corner of his mouth lifted with an old private recognition. "Congratulations," he said simply. The months that followed were not free from unease. There were still columns and comments. A late-night host lobbed a joke that landed sourly with their employees. But the worst of the momentum had passed. People returned to their desks and to the rhythm of work. The strategy channel split into a dozen smaller threads, some professional, some mundane. Life continued. At home, the pregnancy became a steady, private joy. Nina felt it in small ways at first, a queasy morning, then the sudden tenderness when she smelled toast. Sam, who had been so practiced in public courts, discovered the private intimacy of carving out time to be present in ways that required no publicity.
He learned that being present sometimes meant sitting in a kitchen with no plan, stirring a sauce, listening to the world denominator of her breath and heartbeat. They decided on a measured disclosure: parents first, a handful of friends, HR, and a core leadership team. Nina drafted a succinct internal note to the company, one that prioritized privacy but acknowledged the fact of family on their terms. They planned an all-hands meeting with HR to remind everyone of the policy around personal information and to emphasize the boundaries around professional conduct. Transparency, they had learned, didn't mean broadcasting all the details. It meant telling the truth when it mattered and protecting the people who matter. They agreed, too, on public presence. Nina would not be the passive figure people assumed she could be. She would attend certain client matters when her presence mattered for relationship building. She would also maintain the privacy she valued. Sam proposed a small ritual to mark the change. Every Sunday morning for the rest of the pregnancy, they would make pancakes together and set aside the evening for no devices. The ritual was small, but for both of them it felt decisive. There was one public reckoning Sam knew he had to do. He would speak privately with the people who had amplified the photograph. Not to shame, but to instruct. He pulled Max aside and said, "We're in a position where our actions reverberate. When something seems salacious, think about the people who will be hurt. We'll talk to the team about ethics." Max, who had always rounded toward both ambition and conscience, took the instruction to heart. He organized a workshop on workplace privacy and professional boundaries. The effect was subtle but real. People became more careful with other people's lives. In the small orbit of friends and family, reporters calmed, and a certain dignity resumed. For Nina, that larger social piece mattered less than the one that lived in the space between her and Sam. The nights when they simply cooked together, rice, then eggs, then a roast, were the ones she filed away like spare stitches. The pregnancy test sat in the bathroom cabinet for a week before she put it in the drawer with plane tickets and an old ticket stub Sam had kept. It was simple evidence of a future that had nothing to do with the gossip cycle. At a company retreat months later, there was an exercise, an icebreaker that Sam and Nina took in a different way. Partners and leaders were asked to describe relationships in the workplace as if they were recipes. Sam's reply was terse: trust, measured; time, long; patience, generous. Nina, who was asked next to give her recipe, smiled and said, "A lot of small attentions, and don't forget salt, taste often." People laughed, and the laughter was warm. Nothing about their lives was theatrical at that moment. It was simply anchored. After the retreat, a junior colleague pulled Nina aside and said, "I'm glad you decided to tell people. I worried." Nina put a hand to her belly and felt the small, almost imperceptible movement. "It mattered to us to choose how," she said. "That's all." There were, of course, further encounters with Mira and Hans over time. Mira's eventual role in their story was not as a villain or a conspirator, but as a person whose ambitions had been perhaps untempered by empathy. She took steps to reframe her networking, less about angles and more about relationships. She sent Nina a small bouquet of flowers once, not the wildflowers that had been left at the party, but an arrangement of white tulips with a note, "For respect and for starting again in a better way." Hans's place in the story shifted as well. He was ultimately a ledger of their past, more than a present adversary. Over coffee, he offered a frank piece of advice, less sentimental than practical. If you want the world to stop inventing stories, you have to give it fewer reasons to. That doesn't mean hiding. It means choosing what you show. Nina accepted the observation with rancor. She had moved beyond proof to preference. The innermost reconciliation, however, was the one they kept between themselves. There was a night, months after the tender, and after a lull that had stripped the adrenaline out of their days, when Sam returned home with a small box that looked at first like a business card holder. He set it on the kitchen table and watched her reaction. "What's this?" she asked. He opened it. Inside was a paper ring, a playful, informal token that Sam had scribbled his own vow upon in a careful, slightly embarrassed scrawl. It wasn't a jewelry box or a certificate. It was a private thing. He had written in messy ink, "I will name the small things. I will choose you. I will be present." Nina laughed, a soft sound that rose like steam from a pot. She reached for his hand and pressed her thumb into the ink where his promise sat. He had always been calmer with numbers than with feelings, but the proof was in his gestures, the saved seat, the tea he made on long Thursday nights, the way he had chosen honesty in a client meeting rather than damage control. "You already are," she told him. "You show up." They cooked dinner together, not like people on stage, but as two people who had been through a storm and found the kitchen again. Sam trimmed lemons for a dish, and Nina hummed as she stirred. The bouquet from months ago, wilder now, carefully dried, sat on the windowsill, a small relic that had survived petals and a panic and the slow work of mending. Outside, the city settled into a night that felt ordinary and Britishly indifferent to dramas. The pregnancy reached that stage where the world began offering advice unasked for. People volunteered baby names, theories about temperament, and old wives' tales about cravings. Sam's mother called every Sunday with recipes and stories of their family. Nina's parents arrived for a weekend and made pancakes the way she remembered from childhood. The small domestic life they had guarded and then revealed continued to accumulate evidence. A tiny onesie folded with care in a drawer, a charcoal sketch Sam made of his wife's profile, a packet of coffee beans labeled "For Two." A public acknowledgement came quietly and precisely. In an internal all-hands, Sam spoke about values, boundaries, and leadership, and then paused, not for public spectacle, but to mark a transition. "I want to thank my team," he said simply, "for doing the work and for doing it with integrity. And I want to say that my life is changing in a deeply personal way. Nina and I are expecting. We did not seek publicity for this, but we also don't want gossip to be the first story anyone hears about our family. Please respect our privacy. We will make announcements in due course." There was applause that was genuine and not performative. The handoffs that followed, HR reminders about privacy, a renewed code of conduct, a training on digital responsibility, felt like walls being built to keep the curious at a polite distance. The office learned again how to compartmentalize. The public learned something about dignity in leadership. The cliff of the story had been the photograph and the way pixelation could scaffold a rumor. The reconciliation arc was not a single cinematic reveal so much as a sequence of small decisions made in the interior lives of the people involved. They decided when to tell parents. They disciplined behavior for the junior associate. They created structures that prioritized decency. They also celebrated. When Nina's first ultrasound showed a tiny heartbeat flickering on a screen, both of them cried. Sam with a quiet, considered release. Nina with the wild, unregulated gratitude of someone who had been through an ordeal and come out with a gift. Months later, after the courtship of gossip had grown pale, there was a small ceremony to mark the life growing inside Nina and their decision to reframe their public presence. They invited close family and a few friends. It was not a spectacle, no press, no carefully curated social media, but it was deliberate. Sam stood up and spoke with a briefer candor than he usually allowed himself in public settings. He talked about responsibility, about the way love asks you to be better, and he thanked those who had steadied them. Nina listened. In the circle of people there, Faye and Mr. Knott and Max wore expressions of something like relief. The room was full of ordinary things, cups, plates, the smell of baking, that meant more to Nina than columns ever could. As they left that night, someone had left a cake on the table, simple, with a single candle that they didn't light. It was the small, community-made kind of celebration that felt truest. Change, when it comes in the delicate form of a child, reframes priorities. Sam and Nina adjusted their calendars to guard time. They became more deliberate with decisions about who they would allow into their private life and when. They learned to say no in polite ways that protected their family. And when gossip resurfaced, a late-night blogger circling back to an old thread, they had a base of truth and a public that had seen the steadiness of their work and the dignity of their response. One evening, not long before the baby was due, Sam came home with a small wrapped box and a taller folded note. He set them on the counter and sat with her. "I don't believe I'm going to be a great writer of speeches," he said, "but I have a few words I want you to hear." He read the note aloud. It was a quiet, unvarnished vow, no grand pronouncements, just the things that matter to them: to protect, to choose, to be present. At the end, he laughed a little and added, off script, "and to always save you a seat." Nina stood and kissed him, and it was the kind of small, ordinary gesture that had always been their language: practical, warm, exact. The box contained a simple token, a small silver spoon engraved with the date when their child was due. It was not jewelry or an extravagance. It was a promise for breakfasts to come. They talked about the future, not in terms of headlines, but in terms of diapers and middle-of-the-night feedings, of the people they wanted around their child, of the culture they wished to build at the office for parents. Sam promised Nina more than words could measure, that he would be at home when he could be, that he would insist on boundary lines at work, that he would not allow a photograph to define the family he chose to make. On the morning that the paper carrying the old headline finally receded from the front page of people's attention, Nina made pancakes with the same small ritual they had agreed upon since the pregnancy began. Sam sat opposite her, hands warm around his mug, and she placed the engraved spoon on the table. The bouquet from the lobby, now carefully preserved, sat by the window with a new sprig of baby's breath tucked in. They ate slowly. The world outside continued its ceaseless churn,
and news apps still flashed with items of interest that never seemed to quiet. But inside their apartment, the noise fit a different pattern, the comfortable hum of two people who had navigated a rupture and chosen one another again and again. Later, Sam walked Nina to the door as she left for a day of meetings. He touched the small of her back in the way he always had, brief, protective, and said, "When you get back, make me breakfast. Burn it if you want. I'll still love it." She grinned. "Deal," she replied, "but you're making the coffee." Before she closed the door, she turned and added softer, "Thank you." "For what?" he asked. "For believing," she said. "For choosing."